All right. So today we're talking about chronic wasting disease in Ohio's deer herd. And joining us, we have Clint McCoy, who is a deer biologist with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife. So thank you so much for joining us, Clint. I will turn the screen over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Marnie. Let me see if I can get this thing shared. And Marnie, if you'll let me know if that's going.
Looks good to me.
Okay, perfect. All right. Looks like we had 40 plus people in here today, so that's awesome. Thank you all for showing up to hear about chronic wasting disease and what's going on here in Ohio. I did see several names on there that I recognized or have seen before. So some of this information may be, somewhat repetitive for you guys, but uh, what I plan to do is just kind of go through, just kind of start to finish where we started with CWD here in the state, and kind of all the way up through where we are now, and some of the things, challenges that we're facing, some of the ways to move forward. So we'll get kind of just get right into it here. Quick outline. I think I have to do the obligatory what is CWD part of the talk. Just when you have folks out there that maybe this is the first time hearing about chronic wasting disease. So we'll make sure everyone is on the same page with that. And then kind of the bulk of the talk, I think, today will be mostly a timeline of what's happened here in Ohio. We'll talk kind of step by step uh, what we've seen, and then responses to those things along the way. Kind of bring us right up to where we are now. I'll talk a little bit about hunting in a disease surveillance area. We do. Marty mentioned the workshops that we're doing in partnership with them. Those are pretty heavily focused on hunters in the DSA, and what it takes to, what are the things that hunters need to know when they're hunting in a DSA. But I'll touch on that briefly here. If there's more questions afterwards, obviously, we'll be glad to take those. And then finally, kind of the end of the talk, a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more kind of looking into the future type stuff. What CWD means for deer and deer management. And then of course we'll wrap up with the Q&A. So get right into what is CWD. The basics about chronic wasting disease is that it's an always fatal neurological disease that affects members of the deer family. Deer family obviously means white-tailed deer, but mule deer, caribou, and moose and elk are all affected, or can all be affected by this disease. Unique to this type of disease is that it is a prion disease, which is different than most diseases that we're familiar with. Prion disease it's a protein, and it's a protein that naturally occurs in the body, but becomes disease. It results in disease when these proteins become misshapen or malformed. And we don't know the specific mechanics behind it, but once these prions become misfolded and come in contact with other normal prions, it tends to set off this chain reaction. And these malformed prions, they change shape, and they kind of clump together and create lesions in nervous system tissue, and most notably the brain. And once you begin to develop holes in your brain, we obviously know that doesn't lead to good things. A characteristic that's pretty that makes this disease very difficult to manage is that it is spread through various ways, namely animal to animal contact. So this prion can be can be shed through various bodily fluids, tissues, so saliva, blood, feces, urine, those sorts of things carry prions outside of the body, which make them and can be transferred to other individuals in the population. The disease has a very long incubation period. So from the time a deer is infected with chronic wasting disease, it can be up to a year and a half before they start showing outward signs of being sick. So for that entire period, though, they look and act normal. They can be shedding infectious prions into the environment, or having direct contact with other individuals in the population. And once those, all the while they are infected with the disease, they're potentially releasing some of these prions into the environment. Every time they urinate, defecate, lick a branch, those sorts of things, and those prions can remain infectious in the environment for a number of years. And finally, there's no cure for animals that become infected with this disease. To kind of round out what it is, what this disease is, the more formal categorization for CWD is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. And this is the family of diseases that include things like scrapie in sheep, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease. That's the one that most folks are familiar with when it comes to prion diseases. They've heard about the debacle of in Great Britain with mad cow disease and eventually infecting some humans and actually causing death. There is a natural form of prion disease in humans. It's what most would call, scientists would call sporadic. It's Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is a very rare prion disease in humans. There is the other type of human disease, and that is variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which was what arose from mad cow disease, essentially. The Centers for Disease Control and their stance on chronic wasting disease. Currently, there's no strong evidence that exists that CWD is transmissible to humans. It is thought that at the current time, there is a fairly significant species barrier, and it is a disease of deer and deer only. But given that nothing is ever 100% certain, the CDC does recommend that hunters test their deer when they are hunting in areas of known occurrence, and that they do not consume meat of an animal that tests positive for chronic wasting disease. All right, so if CWD turned these animals a different color, if they made them look differently on the landscape, it would be a much easier disease to manage. But unfortunately, that is not the case. When you think about a deer that's sick, you would typically think about deer that look like any of these. Very scrawny, emaciated, obviously showing outward signs that something is wrong with them. And in all of these cases, these are deer that were positive for chronic wasting disease. Now, the danger in assuming that this is what a deer with chronic wasting disease looks like is this is only the end stage. So remember, I said that it has a long incubation period. For the first year and a half, that deer does not look like that. Once the deer starts showing outward signs of being sick, it's a very quick downhill process, and they die relatively quickly. So these are short-term symptoms, essentially, before the animal succumbs to the disease. 99% of the time, if you see a deer that is positive with chronic wasting disease, it's going to look like any of these, which are just your normal everyday, what you would consider a healthy looking animal. And in fact, these two bucks here were harvested in Wisconsin. Both bucks fully healthy. They were, if I remember right, harvested on the same day, both doing what bucks do during the hunting season or breeding season and carrying on normally. Both with you know very nice looking antlers, full body size. Both of those bucks ended up being positive for chronic wasting disease. So it just goes to show you that outward signs are not what we can use to identify disease with any level of accuracy. And even I guess I'll go as far as to say that in areas where they are conducting pretty substantial management, say Illinois, for instance, where um, where they're harvesting lots of deer, shooting lots of deer in CWD areas, 90+% of their positive deer are showing no symptoms or signs of illness. So just that's an important part of this disease, is that the deer appear in most cases absolutely normal. So just briefly, we'll go through this progression over the last 20+ years of chronic wasted disease in North America. So prior to the year 2000, the disease was pretty much the known distribution of the disease was confined to northeastern Colorado and southeastern Wyoming. Once folks started looking for the disease, we started finding it elsewhere. And by 2005, it had crossed the Mississippi, and it was well established in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And we also had detected it in the panhandle of West Virginia. By 2010, things haven't changed a whole lot, but there is some outward spread from the kind of the original known distribution there in Western United States. And by 2015, we're starting to add several states to the ledger. We had at that point had our first captive CWD positive here in Ohio. You see that yellow dot there. Those captive deer were all depopulated. But we're starting to see things show up in Michigan and Minnesota and Missouri. So things are progressing. And by 2020, we've added many other states: Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas has got in the mix, Virginia, and Pennsylvania is growing quite substantially in their numbers of cases and geographic distribution. And this is what it looks like today, where we now have 35 of our 50 states have confirmed positives in their wild deer herds. Most recently, California and Washington. But the disease has spread significantly across the continent. Places where it was initially established, say southern Wisconsin, we see what has happened in those states where it started as a pretty small number of counties and now covers a good chunk of the state. So CWD is doing what CWD does, and that is it increases in prevalence and spreads in geographic distribution. Sometimes slowly. It took 20 years in Wisconsin for it to go from a few counties to half the state, but it is doing what it does. Okay, so that's kind of a general look at what CWD is and what it looks like kind of nationally. Let's jump into CWD here in Ohio and kind of where things started and how we got where we are now. In the fall of 2020, that was when we discovered our first positive wild deer. And this was a mature buck. That is actually a picture of the buck that tested positive. Again, kind of emphasizing the fact that looking at that deer, nothing screamed disease. Big, healthy body, large antlers. But that deer was taken to a taxidermist. We have a taxidermist cooperators program here in Ohio where we utilize taxidermists to collect samples for our routine surveillance of the disease. So we've been surveilling for chronic wasting disease since the early 2000s, so 20 years or so at this point. A more recent advancement in our surveillance strategy has been to utilize taxidermists across the state to get the to procure samples for us. So this particular buck went to one of our partnering taxidermists and just so happened to be, I think it was, a handful of deer that year. And it turned up that it was positive. So it's much a surprise to us as well as many of those in the general area. So following that first positive, we kind of jumped into what do we got here mode, as in we got to figure out what the footprint of the disease looks like. So once we've kind of detected that first positive, it's kind of all hands on deck to sample as many deer in that general vicinity of that positive to get an idea of what the distribution and prevalence of the disease looks like. So we jumped right in. Our District 2 staff did an amazing job, and we had several controlled deer hunts on Killdeer Plains Refuge. So I guess I didn't mention that before, but that our first positive there was just north of the refuge, within about 2 miles or so of the refuge. So that gave us a unique opportunity to sample lots of deer from land that we control in Killdeer Plains. And so we had hunters who come in, harvest lots of deer, 171 actually over the rest of that 2020 season. And we did discover a second positive deer on Killdeer Plains, yearling doe. So now that we had 2 positives, we had some additional postseason surveillance using our own staff on and around Killdeer Plains. Ended up removing an additional 72 deer there, and without having any others test positive. So the summer provided an opportunity for us to initiate some regulation changes in and around that area for the upcoming hunting season. So by the fall of 2021, roughly 6 months after we had detected disease for the first time here in Ohio, we declared a disease surveillance area in and around where the first positive was detected. And so essentially what the disease surveillance area does is, at that point, it was 3 things. It was requiring deer that are harvested during certain periods of the year to be sampled. So hunters that harvest a deer, at that time, it was during the 7-day gun season, the first couple of weekends of archery season. I believe those were the ones, maybe a couple of others. But anyways, there were several dates throughout the deer season where hunters were required to bring their deer to be sampled. The other thing that it does is prohibit baiting and feeding within those areas. Obviously, we're trying to remove artificial concentrations of deer to limit the spread of disease and the contact between individuals. And then the third thing, and maybe the most difficult one for hunters to overcome at sometimes, is the carcass movement restrictions, where we cannot take a carcass or any high risk carcass parts outside of the DSA unless they're delivered to a certified taxidermist or processor. So that creates some issues. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit later in the presentation about what that means for hunters and the like. But those are the 3 main things that declaring a DSA means. So with the DSA, we were able to test roughly 1,100 deer in that 3 county area. 8 of those were positive for chronic wasting disease. You can kind of see that distribution there on the map. All 8 of those, again, relatively close to the initial detection there in southern Wyandot County. So we have relatively concentrated positives in that area. Though we did add 5, those 8 positives represented 5 townships across 2 counties, southern Wyandot and northern Marion. So in the winter, so following that, the 21 deer season, we embarked on a targeted removal effort. In essence, what we were doing, those circles you can see on the right-hand side there, the white kind of buffered circles are a mile buffer around the known positives at the time. The yellow buffer is a 2 miles from the known positives. And so what we wanted to do was focus in on the areas of immediately adjacent to known positives, and given us the greatest probability of removing positive or potentially positive deer. And when you have disease like this on the landscape, the most important thing for us to do at that point is try to remove as many diseased animals as possible to interrupt the transmission of disease. So our District 2 staff did an amazing job engaging landowners in this general area and ended up gaining access to about 15,000 acres of private land. And again, we were fortunate in this situation, quote unquote fortunate. I don't know, it could go both ways, but fortunate that it showed up in an area where we had a large acreage of public land that we had control of, or that we could kind of do some of these activities on without having to worry about getting permission. So that was an additional 11,000 acres. So roughly 25,000 acres that we were able to work on that first year with some targeted removal effort. We contracted with USDA Wildlife Services. This is what they do, and they're really good at it. And so we decided the most efficient way to tackle this problem was to go with them. We had 4 nights of operations in I guess it was early March of 2022, and removed 180 deer. One of those was a positive adult female. All right, so fast forward about 6 months later, we're in fall of 2022. Really, the only thing that changed at this point was moving from a kind of a township-based DSA to one that encompassed full counties. So rather than just portions of Hardin and Marion County, we went to the whole county to include in the DSA. The main reason for that was to allow for implementation of harvest regulations. Our harvest regulations are promulgated at the county level. So kind of bumping that DSA designation up to the county level allowed us to specify specific harvest regulations in those areas. And the two specifically that we initiated in the fall of 2022 was an earlier start to archery season and a 3-day early firearm season in these 3 counties. These early seasons were designed to increase harvest. We know that smaller populations are less likely to spread disease. So the idea here is that we get less deer on the ground. And then the other thing that we thought would be kind of help minimize disease spread was shifting a larger portion of our harvest earlier in the hunting season. And essentially what we were trying to do was remove more of the harvest prior to the breeding season. So currently, before these regulations were put in place, you had archery season that ran up through December and or late November. And we would harvest a good number of deer, but then you have the 7-day gun season that comes in kind of after most of the breeding has occurred. And that's where the bulk of the deer harvest occurs. So what we wanted to do was move some of that harvest prior to breeding season and take some of those animals off the landscape before they have a chance to do what deer do during the breeding season. And that's increase their movement rates, increase their movement distances, interact with lots of deer, which again promotes potential disease spread. So we were trying to remove as many deer off the landscape before that occurred as possible. So to show you how that worked or whether it worked, here we're looking at a typical, this is a 3-year average prior to the implementation of these early seasons in these counties. And what you're looking at is the cumulative harvest across the season. So if you look at, say that big jump, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but if you look at the big jump from days like 64 to 73-ish, that's the 7-day gun season because we harvest a lot of deer within that fairly short window. And then, by the end of the season, we're at 3,700 deer across those 3 counties. And that's kind of so that's kind of how this chart works, is looking at the cumulative harvest by day of the hunting season. Now, the first year of implementing our early firearm season, we see a fairly significant shift in that distribution of the harvest. And primarily what we're looking at is this bump here, this early firearm season, in early mid-October. What it did was we reached roughly 25% of the total harvest for the season nearly a month sooner. So we shifted, we went from reaching 1,000 deer harvested on, say, the 43rd day, all the way back to about the 20th day, or I'm sorry, about the 15th day of the season. So nearly a month sooner, we reached the 1,000 deer harvest threshold. And kind of a bonus there is that during that 3-day season, we actually did remove 3 bucks that were positive for CWD. So there was some good, actually quite a bit of good things that happened as a result of that early season. Those were three positive bucks that were removed before they could kind of do their thing all around the landscape in which they were living. So to summarize kind of the sampling and testing of the 2022 season, we had roughly almost 3,000 hunter harvested deer tested in that 3-county area. Again, we had the DSA expanded to the entirety of Hardin and Marion counties. A large portion of those counties we would not expect CWD to be to show up, essentially, because what we know at this point is that our CWD positives are pretty well concentrated in that southern Wyandot, northern Marion County area around Killdeer Plains. So a large portion of Hardin and Marion counties aren't as much at risk at this point. So we have 3,000 samples across those 3 counties, but a good number of those samples we would not expect CWD to show up. But we did have 7 positives, and all of those were where we would expect it to show up, and that's in and around Killdeer Plains. We did have a couple that are kind of trending eastward a little bit here in adding that Grand Prairie Township there in Marion County. But in general, we're still seeing the positives showing up in a fairly concentrated area around Killdeer Plains. So again, we felt that we could make some hay if we removed some additional deer in that core area around Killdeer Plains. One of the things that we did differently in the postseason of 2023 was to allow landowners the opportunity to remove additional deer. Essentially, what we did was we used our deer damage permitting system to issue permits to interested landowners in the vicinity of known positives to remove additional deer after the season. We had 32 participating landowners that first year, and they removed 26 deer with 0 positives. We also basically after we gave landowners the opportunity to remove some deer, we went in and with an additional effort, 3-night effort, and removed 132 deer in the general, basically within those 1 to 2 mile buffers of known positives. And we ended up with an additional 4 positives as a result of our agency removals. All of those, again, were right there in and around Killdeer Plains. So given what, our early seasons seem to have worked, at least in that they moved the harvest earlier. They did not increase harvest to the degree that we were hoping, and really not at all. But they did move harvest earlier, which was a net positive for us. So there wasn't a whole lot changed moving into last fall of 2023. We hadn't changed any boundaries, given that the positives we had detected up to that point were all still within, right around Killdeer Plains, or within a couple of miles of there. So last year we had hunters again submitting roughly 2,600 deer for testing across those 3 counties. But now we've got 26 positives, and we have several new townships, and we added 2 new counties. We added Allen County, almost a whole county away. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but Allen County, the far west edge of this map here, we did detect a positive there, and that was actually not a result of having a DSA. That deer was tested again as part of our routine surveillance efforts in our utilizing those cooperating taxidermists. That Allen County positive was a buck that a hunter harvested, took to a taxidermist to have it shoulder mounted, and the taxidermist just collected the sample as part of his routine surveillance that he's doing for us, and it turned out that deer is positive. And then we had our first positive there in Hardin County last year. But there are some somewhat troubling trends in that we are starting to see, at least as of last year, much larger geographic distribution. Outside of, even if we ignored the Allen County positive, we're starting to see some fairly significant geographic spread across the county. In those, particularly northward and eastward in Wyandot County. And then we're getting, of course, that westward movement into Hardin County, and then even southerly, almost into Union County at this point. So the winter of 2024, just a couple of months ago, we again offered landowners the opportunity to assist with our efforts. We had roughly 30 landowners signed up, representing somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 acres, and they removed 50 deer. Much better showing this year than last, and one of those was positive. We changed our kind of our focus with our agency removal in this past winter. Given the geographic spread that occurred, the relatively low numbers of deer that we had been able to harvest in past years, and the limited impact that it was that was having on the general population of in the core area, we decided to focus our efforts this past winter, this past March, on the fringes of where we know CWD to exist. So some of those areas where CWD had kind of we saw that it had expanded, where we haven't done as much surveillance as we have in other places. That's where we wanted to focus our efforts this past spring or this past winter to potentially inform future management actions. And so those are highlighted here where we really focused that targeted removal effort in we had some in Crawford County over here to the east, and then kind of the southern and western portions of the known distribution, the far western obviously being Allen County. The 2-night effort at that point resulted in 130 deer removed, and none of those were positive. Again, the fact that none were positive wasn't particularly surprising, given that we're working on the fringes of the known distribution of the disease. Even in the core, when there's at this point only a couple of percent of the deer infected with disease, being on the fringes means even a fraction of those are going to be positive. So that wasn't a big surprise, but somewhat a relief at that point. So now I want to kind of walk you through really quickly. You probably weren't able to keep up with all the numbers of positives as we kind of went through that timeline. But I'll set the stage that we are currently at 49, and this is the progression of how we got there. 2020, those were our first 2 positives. The first one there being just north of Killdeer Plains, the second one being during the controlled hunt there. Our first year of a DSA in the area resulted in 9 positives. The second year of a DSA there resulted in 11 positives. And then this past year, where we had 27 positives. And again, the geographic distribution does appear to be widening to some degree, even if you ignore the Allen County one. Okay, so that's CWD in Ohio at this point. Kind of the facts, the timeline, where we've been. Now let's get into what it means to hunt in an area with CWD and in a DSA. So first of all, if you are a hunter and you are hunting in the DSA, know that the boundaries are changing for the fall of 24. Not much, but they are changing to reflect some of the changes in the distribution of known disease. We've added 2 townships to the DSA in Allen County, Jackson and Auglaize townships. And just to recap what a disease surveillance area means, no baiting and feeding. There are carcass movement restrictions in that you cannot take high-risk parts out of the DSA unless it goes to a certified taxidermist or processor within 24 hours. There is a mandatory testing period. I'll talk about that in a second. And there are a couple of early season opportunities for you. There are the early season opportunities for this year. Nothing different than what's been done in the past. It's still about a 2-week head start on the archery season and a early firearm season there in mid-October. The mandatory days we've dropped. So last year we had 10 to 14 days. I can't remember off the top of my head. We've reduced the number of mandatory days down to 4. And the reason for that is we don't need as many samples as we were getting and to inform what's going on with the disease. We just, the way that the sampling frame works, we can get the information we need to determine changes in prevalence with much fewer samples than we have been getting. So we don't want to waste our staff time, our effort on manning stations during mandatory testing days, and it makes it, at some level, it can be a little bit of a hassle for our hunters. So we've reduced the number of days of mandatory testing down to 4, And those will be the first 2 days of the early firearm season in October and the first 2 days of the statewide normal firearm season, the first week of December. Now, just because we've dropped the number of mandatory days to 4 does not mean that hunters can't get their deer tested if they want to. We will have a number of these drop-off locations across the DSA where hunters are able to use those at any point during the season. Not just during the mandatory testing days, but at any point during the season, a hunter harvests a deer and wants to have his or her deer tested. They can do so by dropping them off at any of those self-service kiosks. We have, again, during the mandatory days, we'll have a couple of staff testing locations across the DSA. Or we can direct them to places that they can have their sample pulled. We work with a number of taxidermists in the area, cooperating taxidermists that may be able to pull a sample for them if they need to. So if you're hunting into DSA or really anywhere for that matter, these are what we would consider high risk parts, and those are parts where prions are found in greater concentrations than they are in other tissues. And those are brain, spinal cord, spleen, eyes, and other lymphoid tissues. So we recommend that at any time you're handling any of these high risk parts, that the best way to dispose of them is to dispose of them by double bagging them and setting them out with your household trash. A landfill, clay-lined landfill is the recommended destination for all high-risk cervid parts, because prions are known to bind very heavily, very tightly to clay, so that if those parts end up in a clay-lined landfill and that deer was positive for chronic wasting disease, we have essentially confined those prions to that landfill, and to not expose other deer to the potential disease-causing agents. And again, if you're taking a whole if you're hunting in a DSA, you harvest a deer. If you're removing that deer from the DSA, that you're taking it from Wyandot County, and you had traveled from, say, Athens County, if you want to go back home with that deer, you have to take it to a certified taxidermist or processor within 24 hours. Essentially, we just don't want, it's not the transportation of these parts that is the risk, it's the disposal of those parts once they get where they're going. So if you took a positive deer from the DSA and took it home to, say, Athens County, and you process the deer yourself and then toss the rest of the carcass out on the back 40, the deer was positive, we've just deposited prions in a new area, and we just want to avoid that at all possible. Certification is really easy. Certification can be done as a business, as a taxidermist. If you're a taxidermist or processor, you can become certified as a business, but it's also available to individuals. So for that example that I just gave, where you were taking the deer home to process yourself, if you become certified, that would be legal, and you can become certified as an individual. You go to our website. There's a video to watch, an educational video about chronic wasting disease and what you need to know about proper disposal. And you watch the video, take a short test after the video is over, and you can become certified to handle high risk carcass parts, essentially. And when you do that, you're attesting to the fact that you will dispose of those high risk parts properly. We have made some amenities available to folks hunting in the DSA to try to ease the burden on hunters a little bit. We provided some dumpsters and some skinning locations where folks can hang their deer and start the butchering process on site. This is a couple of shots one from Killdeer Plains, the other, I believe, from Wyandot Wildlife Area. where hunters are utilizing these amenities to to ease the burden of some of these carcass movement restrictions. That hotline there, that 419 number, that is essentially what we call our CWD hotline, and that's good for those hunters that are utilizing or hunting in the DSA. Anytime they have questions, they can call that number. There will be a live person answering that phone call during mandatory inspection days. Otherwise, you can call that number, leave a message, and someone will get right back with you regarding any questions that you might have about where you might need to take your deer if you want to get it tested, for instance, or any other questions that you may have about chronic wasting disease. And again, kind of the wrapping up here about hunting in the DSA. Testing is kind of where the Division of Wildlife is moving some of its focus, in that we want hunters to be able to get their deer tested if they want to, and they can do it at any time throughout the season that they harvest their deer. And so if you're hunting in a DSA, that's pretty easy because there's going to be a number of self-service kiosks distributed, excuse me, distributed across the DSA. Those kiosk locations or self-service locations will be available on our website. We're working on a kind of a brand new CWD dashboard that should be available prior to deer season starting. Kind of a one-stop shop where you'll be able to go and see, not only look at how many deer have been tested, how many have been positive, and look at some of the data, but you'll have essentially a working map that will help you find certified taxidermists and processors. You'll be able to find kiosk locations. Where can I go? Where does the division put dumpsters out so that I can go dump my high-risk parts in? All of those things will be available in one location. So that's somewhat exciting for us. If you're hunting outside the DSA, you're of course welcome to drive to our DSA where we've put some self-service kiosks, but if you're pretty far away, that may be not possible. Give us a call. We will, if you're hunting outside DSA and you want your deer tested, we will make sure that to give you the opportunity to do so. We can possibly direct you to some of our partnering taxidermists that are willing to pull samples for folks to get that deer tested. We may have you go to one of our local, either a district office or one of our work units to have staff pull those samples for you. In any case, if you're looking to get your deer tested and you're far away from any known self-service kiosk, just give us a call and we'll figure out a way to have your deer tested. And then finally, just mention real quick, some states are experimenting with these self-sampling kits. They're basically pre-prepared kits that hunters that they can distribute to their hunters, those that request them. Essentially, it has all of the things that a hunter might need in order to pull and ship a sample. So it's a way for a hunter to take that responsibility upon themselves to remove those samples, put them in a bag, stick them in the mail, and get them to the lab. So that's something that we're looking at being able to do. Those aren't available quite yet, but that's certainly a future possibility that we'll have hunters engaging more in that level of pulling their own samples. It's not very difficult once you've done it a couple of times. Once you get just a little bit of instruction, those tissues are pretty easy to find and get out of there and get onto a lab. So we may be pushing some more of that opportunity to get deer tested onto the hunter themselves. All right, last little bit that I had here, a little bit more theoretical, I guess, more looking into the future, what CWD means for deer and deer management. CWD has two impacts, essentially. If we just want to go really broadly, it has a direct impact on deer in deer populations. It makes deer sick. It kills deer. So that's an undeniable fact. The way that it does is different in different places. And so I guess the impact that it has is different depending on the species and the environment, the ecosystem. In Western states, uh, particularly talking about mule deer, there's population modeling studies that have been done and are being done that show significant population declines and even the potential for localized extinctions, with one of the primary drivers of these being chronic wasting disease. So that's on one side of the coin, where CWD is a significant threat to the existence of some populations. On the other side, in a different environment, in a different species, whitetails, that long-term impact of disease is not really known yet, at least. Our eastern populations are much more productive than those in the West, where some of these studies have been conducted. And what that means is that these deer in the eastern US can typically live long enough to replace themselves, even in the presence of chronic wasting disease. Now, we know that they don't live long, but they live long enough. And so annual mortality rate for a deer with chronic wasting disease is typically 2 to 3 times higher for a deer with CWD than one that's not. So those deer are going to die. They don't necessarily die from end stage CWD. But what happens is CWD certainly compromises their ability to survive in a number of ways. They have higher likelihood of becoming, of dying as a result of other sicknesses because their immune system is compromised. So think about things like pneumonia, which deer are prone to get, more likely to kill those that have CWD. And then, of course, direct fatalities as a result of predation, vehicle strikes, and hunter harvest are all more likely to occur to deer that have neurological impairments that CWD causes. So while we may not see, this, I guess this is just to illustrate the fact that CWD certainly has an impact on deer. Those that get it are going to die. They're going to die at a higher rate than those that don't have it. Long term, if we're looking at population trajectories, those are still unknown in eastern US, given the fact that many of these deer, again, are able to replace themselves. They're able to reproduce at least once before they die of chronic wasting disease. So there's still a lot to be learned here with regards to the long-term population outlooks in places with chronic wasting disease. One of the more, and I would say this is probably for us at this point, or at this stage of the game, is a much more relevant impact, and it's the indirect impact that chronic wasting disease has on deer hunters. And essentially what we've come to realize is that current evidence suggests that hunter behavior changes as a result of chronic wasting disease. And it's out of having significant precautions about eating or handling deer that are positive for chronic wasting disease. And so what we've learned is that as prevalence approaches 40%, it's kind of a threshold where hunter behavior at a larger scale begins to change, and that it becomes harder and harder to continue to hunt or harvest deer when almost half of the ones that you harvest are positive for chronic wasting disease and you're not able to consume them. When this happens, this is extremely costly to us. Hunters are the since we no longer have the predators that we once had to help control populations, hunters are basically it. They are the one mortality factor that is responsible for maintaining deer populations at reasonable levels. And losing hunters to CWD concerns is a costly outcome. That would certainly compromise the ability to manage deer herds. So, kind of contrary to what many would think, at least initially, chronic wasting disease is a huge threat because it's going to kill all the deer. It's almost the opposite, at least initially, at least from the outlook that we're kind of the point that we're in now, is that the danger for us at this point is too many deer as a result of not enough hunters. And again, and then that's where we kind of start down the road of we're kind of making the situation much more ripe for disease to take off. As we lose hunters, the deer population grows in the presence of chronic wasting disease. That means more disease more easily spread. So it's kind of the opposite of what we want to occur, and the opposite of what you might think would occur as a result of chronic wasting disease. And then here's an example. So these are the 4 counties that we've kind of involved in the current disease surveillance area. These are the population trends for those counties. And it's pretty clear that these populations are at all-time highs. These populations have never been larger, likely in the history of history, even before European settlement. These are deer population levels that have not been seen in these areas, and that's despite some of the most liberal regulations that we have in our state. That's despite some relatively significant targeted removal in these areas. We're still battling populations that are extremely large. And so what we want to do in the presence of CWD is to manage for a disease resilient herd. We can't, once disease is on the landscape, that's really difficult to remove. We can control the controllables, and that's the number of deer on the landscape. And managing for a disease resilient herd would mean a younger age structure and a smaller population. So, at the end of the day, if managing disease is important, it starts with managing deer, and fewer deer is essentially a lower probability of disease establishment and lower probability of disease transmission once it becomes available in an area. There's side benefits to fewer deer, and I won't go into those in any great depth, but when fewer deer in the landscape, each one of those individuals in the population are much healthier. When you think about from a productivity standpoint, when you think about antlered production standpoint, and that's a result of deer are density dependent species. The fewer deer on the landscape, the more resources available to each individual, the higher quality each of those individuals will be. So, how do we do this? We got to increase antlerless harvest to lower population densities. Most folks would argue from the outset that, well, that's easy, just increase the bag limit. I'm going to show you why that doesn't work. The average number of deer harvested by successful hunters in Ohio is 1.3. And that pie chart shows you the percentages of deer hunters that harvest each of those categories of deer. Almost 75%, almost 3 out of every 4 successful deer hunters only harvest a single deer. And then you've only got 5% of hunters that are filling a 3 deer bag. So relatively small portion of deer hunters that are willing to shoot lots of deer. And so that's why most every county in Ohio at this point is at least a 3 deer county, meaning that, hunters can take 3 deer throughout the season. We have very few hunters that are filling that 3 deer bag limit. So increasing the bag limit is not the magic wand that most might think it to be. There are some other things that we're looking at doing. One thing that has been done for this coming season is increasing the length of time that the $15 deer management permit is valid. So this year, this is the antlerless only permit that has been in the past typically only valid up through the first day of gun season. So it was only an archery season permit. That's changed for 2024, and it will be valid through the 2-day gun season. So you'll get both the 7-day and the 2-day gun season to utilize a $15 antlerless permit. The idea, obviously, is to get folks. For me as a biologist, I recognize hunters aren't going to harvest more deer than they can utilize. What we're trying to do is get those that kill 0 to kill 1, those that kill 1 to kill 2. And so those might be folks that are typically focused on harvesting a buck. They harvest their buck. Well, for an additional $15, they have the gun season, the bonus season. They can go out with their friends, go out with their buddies, continue hunting, and have that cheap permit in their pocket and use it on an antlerless deer. So again, it's not about filling up the freezers essentially, but it is about moving folks from 0 deer to 1 deer, from 1 deer to 2 deer, and maybe potentially folks that already harvest 2, maybe getting them to harvest an additional. The other thing that the Division of Wildlife is currently doing and will continue to do is advocate for harvest donation. We are working with some folks some processors to become what we would consider a FHFH center, or a processor that's willing to accept donated deer. These are somewhat a work in progress. We don't have very many of these currently. And so the idea is that we would create additional places for hunters to utilize, particularly in and around the disease surveillance area, that they could utilize for harvest donation. We have heard that from some of our hunters in those areas where they would kill more deer if they had somewhere to take the deer. They didn't eat it themselves, but if they could find a place to drop off a deer for donation, they would harvest additional deer. So that's one of the things that we are working on at the moment, is trying to secure additional opportunities for hunters to find places to take deer that they harvest for donation. All right, so I'm almost done here. We'll wrap up real quick, and then we'll get to some questions. CWD is doing what CWD does once it's introduced. It increases in prevalence and geographic distribution. It does so somewhat slowly. It's not what you would consider a raging fire. It's a slow burn, and that's what we'll continue to see. It is established in southern Wyandot, northern Marion counties. There's nothing that we're going to do to eliminate that from the landscape at this point. It is there, and it is here. It is there to stay. I kind of reiterate some of the points that I made just a few minutes ago, is that our most immediate threat is not one of the population disappearing. It's one quite the opposite of a large deer population that is very conducive to spreading disease. And this isn't just confined to where we currently have chronic wasting disease. This is relevant to anywhere in Ohio or beyond, for that matter. The deer populations at large levels, at high densities, they're ripe for spreading disease. And when disease shows up in an area with lots of deer, it's more likely to take hold and it's more likely to spread. So this is not only talking about the DSA, but it's somewhat of a cautionary tale for other parts of the state where CWD has yet to show up, but quite possibly could sometime in the near future. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to deal with these large deer populations, how we're going to increase antlerless harvests and reduce some of these populations to minimize the threat of disease once it arrives. So the Division of Wildlife approach to chronic wasting disease is somewhat twofold at this point. Number one, it's to facilitate increased hunter harvest at some level. And so what that might mean could be regulatory wise. I guess an example would be offering the $15 deer management permit for throughout the up and through the 2-day gun season. It could be utilizing our deer damage procedure to give landowners additional harvest opportunities even after the deer season's over in the areas where disease is occurring, and which is what we've done. And then again, we're working to create these new avenues for deer donation and processing. We know that deer processing can be a bit of a bottleneck for some folks and in some areas where traditional processors are no longer available. And so, particularly in the DSA, at least at this point, we are trying to secure some of those additional avenues for hunters to utilize in deer to donate their deer. And the second thing that we're really focused on is maintaining hunter confidence. And what that means is we just want hunters to continue to hunt. We want them to continue to participate and harvest deer. And a couple of ways that we kind of promote this or hopeful to encourage this is that we will continue with our statewide surveillance program. We will have some enhanced surveillance efforts going on in those counties surrounding where we know CWD exists. So kind of think of a ring of counties around the current DSA. We'll have some increased surveillance going on there, and some increased communication efforts with the hunting public as well, just to inform them of what's going on and what to expect, and offer testing. And that's kind of the big thing is that we want hunters that have a concern about chronic wasting disease to be able to submit a sample for testing if that is what they want to do and would make them more comfortable hunting into the future. That's a small price to pay for on our part to ensure that they continue to hunt and harvest deer. So if anyone is planning to hunt around close to a DSA this year, you will expect to receive some communications. Hopefully, whenever you harvest a deer, you will receive your confirmation number. You'll get a message that will let you know that we're looking to test deer in those counties. And so if you are hunting in those counties where we're looking for additional samples, please find a way to get us your deer, and we'll continue to build on our knowledge base with regards to where disease is and where it quite hasn't got yet. So that's all I had for today. Thanks for joining. And then Marnie, I guess I'll give it back to you and you can fire away with questions.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. That was awesome. Lots of really great information. Folks, if you didn't notice, I popped up a few links as Clint was talking. The last two that are showing up in the chat box would be the Hunt Fish app that he referred to, and then, of course, the Division of Wildlife's information on chronic wasting disease on their website. So that's where you're going to find information on the DSAs that Clint was referring to, location of kiosks, and a bunch of other good information. So wanted to provide some links to that. So yeah, let's get into questions. And we do also have Gary Comer joining us for questions. Gary is also with the Division of Wildlife. He is the Wildlife Management Supervisor for District 1, so in Central Ohio. So welcome, Gary. And all right, first question. I'm just going to start with the Q&As, and if you guys entered some questions in the chat, I did grab those as well. But moving forward, if you have any other questions, you can still access the Q&A and add your questions there. So first question is from Sue. She's asking, is the covering of the nerve cells affected? Could it be caused by something in the environment?
Is the is the covering of the nerve cells affected? I guess I'm not as familiar with the biochemistry of it all. And could it be something in the environment? I'm not quite sure what that is she referring to. I mean, we know that prions are infective from the environment. You know, the deer can become diseased as a result of prions picked up in the environment. Yeah, I guess I don't really know how to answer that per se. Gary, do you have any ideas? Am I missing something there?
Gary, you're muted.
You're muted.
Hang on, folks. And Sue, if you want to reword
Okay.
that in a way, maybe. Sorry, Gary. Go ahead, Gary.
I'm not sure what's being asked there, Clint, other than I'm thinking it may be related to spontaneous CWD, the theory or question behind that.
Okay. Well, yep, Sue, feel free to expound upon that. Oh, she said, oh no, that's what in the environment causes it. I think that's what she's asking. What in the environment causes the disease? So maybe a little bit more information about the prions.
Yeah, so it's not the prions aren't naturally produced in the environment. Prions are naturally produced within the body. The prions are deposited into the environment. The deer or infected individuals will shed those prions into the environment anytime they urinate, defecate. It's in saliva, so it can drip on the ground that way. So the prions become available in the environment because they've been excreted from an animal. I think that's what she's asking there.
Yeah. Okay. If not, Sue, let us know. Okay. Denise is asking, is the test relatively inexpensive? So testing for CWD.
So Division of Wildlife will provide testing to anyone that wants testing to be done. If you were to go on your own, so our testing gets done at the Department of Agriculture in Reynoldsburg. If you were to go there on your own took a deer head there and you wanted to get that deer tested, it would cost you about $80. It doesn't cost us quite that much because we have already pulled the samples for one, so that takes off a good bit of the cost. And then we're sending multiples at once. So we're able to get that done at a much lower cost than $80. But there still is significant cost when you start adding up thousands of samples, surely.
Sure. Another question, is it theoretically possible for human transmission of CWD by eating undercooked venison?
So cooking has nothing to do with it. These prions cannot be destroyed through cooking alone, even burning. If you ever want to do the certification training for taxidermists and processors, you can look through there to go through the various disposal methods. We mentioned in there that burning does not destroy the prions. It takes extremely high pressures and or extremely high temperatures and or pressure to denature these prions, these proteins. So just normal cooking is well below that threshold for sure. And then so the thing with human transmission, there's still ongoing research into whether it's possible. But most everything up to this point is showing a relatively strong species barrier between deer and humans that prevent transmission from occurring. The biggest questions, I think, when it comes to that are the discovery of strains. So at this point, we know that not all CWD is exactly the same. There are some, and I assume it has to do with the ordering of the amino acids within the protein chain, but essentially, there are different strains, and they can can develop different strains of chronic wasting disease, and it's those different strains that we're still not 100% sure about how those will develop. But the ones that they have tested up to this point have shown a very strong species barrier between deer and humans.
Let's hope it stays that way.
We will hope so, yes.
Is it known if the fawns acquire the disease at birth?
They do, yes. There is fetal transmission occurring. And if it's not within the womb, it's would obviously be shortly thereafter. Once if the mother's positive, there's lots of contact shortly thereafter that would ensure that prions are transmitted from one to the other.
Christina is asking, this presentation primarily focused on free-ranging deer, understandably so. So can you speak to the patterns, trends in captive deer and how those may impact the spread in free-ranging deer?
I guess if you're talking specifically about Ohio, and that's where my strength of my knowledge lies. Specifically in Ohio, every deer that dies under fence in Ohio is legally bound to be tested for chronic wasting disease. So we haven't had a positive in the captive population since 2019-ish, I think. So it's been quite a while. It's certainly a threat, but there's lots of regulations in place to try to prevent that from happening. There has been certainly some issues in the past in different states with regard to transporting live animals and their propensity to infect live deer or wild deer through a fence. And there's other states where has been issues with captive cervid owners dumping parts outside of their fence and turning out to be that those were positive and infecting wild deer. So there are bad actors everywhere that can cause issues for sure. But at this point, I feel pretty good about where we are in Ohio with the regulations in place and the testing that occurs within the captive industry.
Thank you. Bill is asking, in the nationwide spread, how did the disease skip over big areas?
Deer travel on a vehicle, either dead or alive. So those, of course, there was some live transport. Deer captive industry was and still is pretty big business in many states. there were a good bit less regulations in place, 20 years ago with regards to moving captive deer across the landscape. A few less regulations about testing and all of these things. Herd certification wasn't quite where it is now, and so there were lots of ways for disease to be moved across the landscape. There's CWD in South Korea because they took live elk or deer, I can't remember which, to a zoo in South Korea that was positive for chronic wasting disease. So it has to do with absolutely artificial movements by humans is how that disease moves in large chunks across the landscape. I talked a lot about live animals, but dead animals as well. So there's a lot of people that live in the East that like to travel out west to hunt elk, mule deer, and the like, and bringing a positive carcass back with you from one of those positive states is certainly possible way to deposit prions into the environment if those parts aren't properly disposed of.
Bill's also asking, how is testing done?
How is it done? So we test the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. So those are so if you went to the doctor and they fill your lymph nodes up under your jaw, those are the lymph nodes that we are removing from the deer that we're sampling. Those lymph nodes get sent to lab. They get sliced up. They get homogenized. At least for the screening test, they'll get homogenized and run through what we call an ELISA. It's enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, I think is what that stands for. It's a screening test. It basically is a one way to get a lot of samples through the machine really quickly. And if it has a positive, we'll then take that sample and they will examine it microscopically with immunohistochemistry, or IHC, which is still considered kind of the gold standard for prion testing, prion disease testing. And that's essentially, they'll stain the tissues and they'll look for holes in the tissue that would be caused by the prion disease. So kind of a two-part test. There's a screening test, and then if one's positive, they want to be extra positive that it's positive, and so they'll do another test.
Excellent, thank you. Couple questions from Nikki. We've answered a few of them already, but she's asking also, can you burn deer remains to kill CWD?
Yeah, that is you cannot. You just can't get it hot enough. Now, some states use incinerators, like industrial grade incinerators, as kind of a service to their hunters. Hey, come drop your deer off here. We'll incinerate them, and those are fine. But a burn barrel, or you just can't get them hot enough to denature those proteins.
I think I read, and I could be wrong, like 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Something is
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my
It's
head, but it's
ridiculously hot
pretty
number.
extreme temperature, and I think pressures have to do with it too. The lab at Reynoldsburg has an alkaline digester that does it, but not everybody has access to an alkaline digester.
Oh, yeah. All right. Stephanie's asking, is there any treatment for the disease? So we know there's no cure, but have there been any treatments researched or anything that help the deer lessen the infection?
Well, no, and to be honest, you really wouldn't want to. You kind of want the deer to die as quickly as possible. And that sounds terrible, but that's to limit the amount of prions that they're able to kind of excrete into the environment, the number of deer that they come in contact with over the course of their lifetime. Ideally, they would die really quickly. So we don't really want to prolong the their lifespan if they're positive for the disease.
Good point. Good question from Steve. Will the Division of Wildlife replace your buck or doe permit if your deer has CWD?
As of now, that's the policy. Yes, is that if you submit a deer that turns out to be positive, you will get a replacement deer tag.
So Sandy's asking, and I'm sorry if you answered this already, how long does a test take? In other words, how long does the hunter have to wait to find out if the deer meat is okay to consume?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, a common one I probably should include in this presentation, actually. So it depends on a couple of things. It depends on how your deer is sampled and when your deer is sampled. If you bring it straight to us early in the season, you could have your results back in a week or so. If it goes to a taxidermist, it kind of depends on when that taxidermist pulls your sample. It's not, you could take your deer to a taxidermist. If he doesn't have time to get to it, he may freeze the head for a couple of weeks until he has time to come back to it, and then he's caping the head, and then he's pulling the samples, and then it's another week before we go visit the taxidermist to pick up all of his samples. So that could be, that could be a long process if you're dropping your deer off at a taxidermist to be sampled. But if you're bringing it to us early in the season, you can expect results back within a week or two. If it's during the busy part of the season when we have lots of samples coming and going, say, the statewide gun season, for example, it could be, a month or more, depending on how backed up they get at the lab. So we usually tell hunters we kind of, we err on the side of caution and say 8 weeks, but it's usually much sooner than that. Nevertheless, we realize that it puts a burden on a hunter that none of those timeframes that I just gave you are timeframes in which you could just hold on to a deer and wait for a test before you go get it processed, right? I mean, you're gonna have to make that decision to go get your deer processed before you're gonna have a test result back. The good news is right now is that if you're hunting in Wyandot, Hardin, Marion counties, there's a 99% chance that your deer is not positive. So your odds are in your favor that you're going to be able to eat your deer, especially in those areas. So, yeah, I mean I guess that's about all. That kind of covers it. Gary, you can add in if you think that there's anything I missed there.
No, and outside of that DSA, Clint, we don't have any idea there, and it would be even more likely that you can eat your deer without concern.
Yeah.
So get out your crystal ball, Clint. Next question is, given what you know about the spread of CWD in Ohio, what do you expect the future landscape to look like in Ohio 2, 5, or 10 years into the future? Any speculations you're willing to share? I know it's a tough question.
No, that's okay. That's a fair question.
Yeah.
And we can look at other states to see what that looks like. I mean, we've seen what happens. We've seen kind of the rate of spread. And given the way that the difficulty in managing the deer numbers that we're experiencing right now, there's no hesitation for me to say that the disease will continue doing exactly what it's doing, and that we will continue to see increases in prevalence. So we went from 11 positives in 22 to 27 positives in 23. I think we'll continue to see that number creep up. We'll continue to see the positives showing up further and further away from kind of what we would consider the ground zero, being around Killdeer Plains. We'll continue to see positives showing up further and further from there. And the more deer that become positive, the further it spreads geographically from the center of infection, the more likely we are to start having hunters moving deer that are positive. And the more likely we are to have what the gentleman asked earlier about those bigger jumps in where positives are occurring. We have lots of folks from Northeast Ohio that come and hunt in our controlled hunts at Killdeer Plains that are taking deer back to Geauga County. The more deer that become positive in and around Killdeer Plains, the more likely that one of those deer, the deer that they're taking back are positive. And the more likely that there's a chance that they don't dispose of them properly, and we have prions deposited on the landscape, kind of in an area disjunct from a current distribution of the disease. So the outlook isn't great if you want to if you don't want CWD, the outlook isn't great. It will continue to spread. It will continue to grow. Our hope is that we can continue to provide the opportunities for hunters to continue participating, provide the confidence that they need, that they can get their deer tested and those sorts of things to try to keep deer populations manageable.
Hunters keep hunting. That's what we
Right.
want.
Right.
Okay. Question from Denise. Since the prions can only be removed by chemical high heat, will there be concentrations at public skinning locations? And maybe you can once again remind us again how to properly dispose of those dangerous bits when you're processing.
Yeah. So I think she's talking about those places that we provided in the DSA where hunters can skin their deer and quarter. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that, especially as time goes on, remember, we're still dealing with a relatively low number of positive deer. The numbers are creeping up, no doubt, and they will continue to. But at the time, we're still dealing with relatively low numbers of deer that are positive. And then those few positives, in order for those places to become, super spreaders, or places where prions are concentrated, you'd have to have multiple of those deer showing up at those places, multiples of those positive deer, which again, so that reduces the probability that that those deer are positive are even visiting those skinning locations. But in any event, if positive deer go there and they're skinned there and those fluids are leaked on the ground, sure, those will be places where prions exist. The good thing, excuse me, I guess the positive thing about that is they're in places where CWD already exists on the landscape. So we're not moving the disease outside of an area of known infection. And then as far as proper disposal, the best way is if you have household trash pickup, is just to double bag it and have it go straight with your household garbage and go to the landfill. If you don't have household pickup, if you can, it'd be great to double bag it and send it to a landfill, or take it on your own. If you can't do that, we do have dumpsters, like I said, available. I think it's 6 locations in the DSA currently that you can take your part, double bag it, throw it in the dumpster, and that dumpster will be emptied at the landfill. So there's, again, that's kind of the number one place is the landfill. So there's several ways that you can get your carcass from your possession to a landfill, either through your household trash, take it to the landfill yourself, or utilize one of our dumpsters that it'll eventually get there.
I'm just remembering that the clay line dumpsters are what are going to really bind those prions, and that's why we want them to go there.
Correct.
Okay. Are you concerned that the disease will spread to fish? I worked in New Mexico diagnostics and learned about prions, prions. Fish in New Mexico have circling disease. I don't know about that
Not a
one.
fish guy. No idea. Never heard of prions and fish,
Not
but
fish people.
yeah.
Not doubting you, Denise. We just don't know.
Yeah, just don't, yeah, don't know about that one. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so this is Sue. I think she's chimed in a little bit more with her question, her first question that we had. She said, what causes the normal proteins to turn into abnormal proteins? Is it similar to dementia?
I wish I knew that answer. I think we all kind of wish we knew that answer. Um, it starts with the existence. It starts with the existence of a malformed prion protein, and once that enters into the system, there is some sort of signaling that happens. And again, we don't know the exact mechanisms, but there's a signaling that signals other prions to take on that same shape, that malformed shape. As far as I guess I'm not as familiar with dementia as I should be as far as what causes it, but behavioral change as a result of damage to the brain, if that's similar, then yes, it would be similar. I don't know that I don't think that the dementia is considered a prion disease, but it is certainly a disease that affects the brain. So maybe someone else can comment on the specifics of dementia, but I don't know.
Okay.
Have any doctors in the house talk
Yeah.
about dementia?
Raise your hand. Any doctors in the house? Great questions, everybody. We do have a few left. You mentioned, Ryan's saying, you mentioned smaller populations can encourage a more disease resilient herd. Is there a target population density?
There's not one smaller than we've got now. Much smaller. In fact, I mean, we're kind of at the point where those small targets don't matter if we can't move the needle at all. So if we can show that we can move the needle and move populations in a different direction other than up, then we can start thinking about targets as far as densities go. But if you think about natural densities of deer back before European settlement, you know, you're in the 20s deer per square mile. So and we're far beyond that when you talk about deer densities in terms of per square mile of habitat available to them. So we got a long ways to go.
Just a few more comments from Denise regarding that last question. She said, disease was first found by humans eating brains. Females were not fed protein, so in hunger, they ate human brains. I think it is called Kulu disease.
Uru, that is one form of prion disease. Absolutely. That was she's right. Yeah, that was cannibalistic in nature.
Interesting.
A tribe somewhere, maybe New Guinea or something like that, where that was a popular ritual, was to eat human brains, and that resulted in many pretty high percentage of prion disease in that population.
Carolyn, I do see your questions. I'm just going to get to a few that were in the chat that came in before yours. Rob is asking, where can they find that certified processor list? Is that posted online?
It is. There's one online now. It's probably, I mean, it was updated last year at some point. It will be updated and available before deer season on the website. It'll be part of our new CWD dashboard. But yeah, you can find at least a majority of what's available on the website right now.
Okay. And that would be the Division of Wildlife chronic wasting disease.
Yeah, if you go to the
Oh, I found it. Yep. So if you
Okay.
guys go to that link that I posted, it was the second link. On the right side, there's a listed map of certified processors and taxidermists. I'll just grab the link real quick and pop it in the chat. There you go. All
And
right.
there's probably, again, I don't know exactly when that was updated, but probably sometime last year.
Yeah.
There's probably been a few added facilities since then. But that should be a good start for you if you're looking for a place.
Okay. And then Rob had another question. As far as you know, is every individual animal susceptible to the disease, or has there been any research on immunity?
Yeah. Yeah. So what there's, and this is some of the newer stuff that's starting to trickle out with regards to how CWD is changing population genetics. And we've seen that in Wisconsin and other places where, and I think Wyoming was the other place where we have some research with regards to that. But that CWD is driving essentially selection to some degree. And it's not that deer are immune to disease, but there are certain genotypes that allow them to live longer with CWD. So it's a kind of a delayed, again, and that kind of, I already mentioned it once, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So it's beneficial to the individual, but not necessarily, maybe not necessarily to the population, given that they have a longer time to spread disease. But there are changes to population genetics that are occurring in places that are heavily infected with CWD. Some of those specifics I can't really get into because I'm not quite sure what they are at this point. A lot of it's relatively new. But as far as we know, there aren't deer that are completely immune. There are deer that have some level of resistance, I guess maybe the right word, where the disease takes longer to kill them. And there's been I think there's been some research in the captive industry too to try to build upon some of that knowledge that there's different genotypes that are more resistant, or I guess that's the right word, more resistant to disease than others. But there are none that are completely immune that we know of.
It's going to be interesting to see how the disease progresses forward with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question, has there been any special efforts to work with Amish and Mennonite communities and hunters for carcass processing certifications, since they are typically unable to do the online training?
Oh, I guess the answer is no, but that's a good point, and that's maybe something that we should look into for sure. So who said that?
I don't know. I didn't catch their
Okay.
name. If
All
if
right.
you're,
Well, that's good. That was good. I like that. So
yeah. Or you could reach out to Clint. I don't know if you can share your email or if you're willing to do that, but perhaps they could reach out to you if you wanted to
yeah.
know a little bit more
We
about
do
it.
have some certification for that because our wildlife officers have computers in their vehicles. And I know a few Amish processors that have become certified by the playing the video for the operator and then assisting them by them answering the questions, and we've certified them that way. But to say we target and go specifically to Amish communities, we have not, but they have come to us to request assistance with that.
That's good to know. Thanks, Gary. Emily, yeah, so in the chat, she added her contact information, Emily Pellegrini. Thank you, Emily, for that question. And then I think our last couple questions are from Carolyn. So just a little bit more and a reminder about eating venison from deer infected with CWD. Tell us one more time, is it safe to do that? Anything else you want to share with folks that are concerned about that?
Consuming deer with CWD. So this is not my personal opinion. This is what, stated straight from the Centers for Disease Control, that there's no strong evidence that CWD can be transmitted from deer to humans. However, in abundance of caution, the CDC does recommend that if you're hunting in an area where CWD is known to exist, that you have your deer tested, and if it does test positive, that you don't consume it. That's straight from the CDC. They recommend not consuming deer that are positive for chronic wasting disease. That's not to say there are, based on the infection rates and the numbers of deer that go harvested but untested in Wisconsin, there are over 10,000 deer a year getting eaten that are positive for CWD in Wisconsin. If eating CWD positive deer is something that we should be concerned about, we will know pretty soon whether that's the case. When you have that many folks eating that many positive deer, I think, you know, if we see no ill effects, then maybe we feel a little bit better about the situation. But if it's going to happen, it would happen there.
Yeah. Yeah. Rob is asking, does cooking break down the protein? I think you answered that already.
Yeah, no,
It does not.
it does not.
Does not. Okay. A thank you from Denise, and I'm sure a lot of our other folks are thanking you as well. Folks, feel free to give a little thank you in the chat. Thank you so much, Clint. That was awesome. Thanks for sticking around for a long list of questions. Gary,
Yeah, no, that's great. I like lots of questions. It means people are interested.
It does. It does. And I sometimes think the questions are just as interesting because we have some pretty smart folks that join us. So I'm going to stop recording. Kathy's going to put up the link to receive credits.